Welcome to Discover the Difference, a podcast brought to you by C3. I'm your host, Jamie Reed, alongside Gabe Earl. And today we have on our show, Tez Steinberg. And I gotta say, listening to Ted talk, I think it invoked fear in me. I mean, this guy was the first human ever to paddle a boat from California to Hawaii. Imagine 71 days at sea, at night, barely sleeping, experiencing some of the most strenuous activity you could ever imagine, encountering wildlife and animals that few humans have ever even seen. All of this was born, as he tells it, out of a state of depression that was compounded by his father's death. And in his honor, he decided to do something special and unique with his life and became inspired to paddle across the ocean and to tie great causes to it. He was so vulnerable and open with everything in his life and how he got to where he was. And it showcases why he's now a keynote and a public speaker that's really revered in the world. I hope you really enjoy this episode with Tez. All right, so you're coming to us from Nederland, Colorado, but in our little pre-talk before Mia got to start the camera, there was an association with Australia and your name shortening from Terrence to Tez.
When I was 17, I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to a school called UnitedWorldCollege of the Adriatic, an international high school in northern Italy, 200 students from 85 countries, all of us on full scholarships. You can imagine what that's like as a kid, right? Leaving. So we all left our families behind.
How old were you?
Went to this little village. I was 17.
Okay.
And so it's a 2-year program. Like I said, students from 85 countries. So while I was there, I met an Australian, and she thought Terrence was far too long, far too formal. And hence I became known as Teza or Tez.
Well, back us up, because I feel like you must have skipped a few things to get qualified to receive a full ride scholarship to this high school in Italy. How did that come to fruition, and where did you get introduced to rowing? And take us back.
Yeah, those are totally different stories, to be honest, but they merged, about 15 years down the road. So the United World College movement is a network of schools in 18 countries. And I was lucky enough to discover it because my older brother also got a scholarship to one of these schools. So when I was like 12, I saw him leave home and go to this amazing international school. His was in Canada. And I saw how it changed his life and opened up his eyes to how big the world is, but also how similar we all are, despite our perceived differences. So that made an impact on me when I was 12. And when I was 16 years old, came time for me to try to apply to these United World Colleges. And it's like applying to a college. It's called an American college. It's called college because it's based on the British system. So it's effectively a high school, do the international baccalaureate degree, and you apply as though you were applying to college. Essays, letters of recommendation, test scores, interviews, all those things. And I was lucky enough to be given one of these scholarships. This was back in 2004. And such a transformative experience.
Is it a religious thing behind it, or is it just
no
experience?
It started, the first United World College started in 1962 in the height of the Cold War. And it began as a European experiment. They said, why does Europe keep killing itself, launching into these world wars? And they thought, an educational innovator, Kurt Hahn, said, well, I think perhaps if we take young people when they're old enough to be mature and informed, but still young enough to be malleable, influenceable, right? Bring them together to study and learn with each other, do a rigorous academic curriculum, but also volunteer in the community. Perhaps they can learn to get along. Turned out it was an effective model. And since then, since 1962, 17 more schools have opened up around the world, and specifically with the mission to make a peaceful and sustainable future. And so the movement has grown. Was lucky enough to participate in it myself.
Wow. So, and it doesn't have anything to do with athletics. It's more of an academic application process.
So each country has its own selection criteria and process and funds their own scholarships. So each country is a little bit different. But in the States, they're looking at how well-rounded a person are you? Are you strong in academics? Yes, for sure. But also, do you believe in this mission to create a peaceful and sustainable world? And will you be a good member of the United World College community and live those values in your work and personal life afterwards? So that's really what they're looking for in young people.
So do they ask you to do stuff like contribute after you leave, or is that just something that everybody decides whether they want to be a part of it or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's up to you, right? We don't sign a contract and say, we're going to give 10% of our income to charity or anything like that. But a lot of students do go into various fields, whether it's NGOs or nonprofits, or some people go into government, science. But it's really simply about creating a global community that understands we have more in common than we have in different. And from there, you build bridges rather than walls. Sounds like a cliche, but when you take students from Israel and Palestine, India and Pakistan, when I was there is the height of the American-Iraq War, right? And you take these young people and you learn from each other. So that's the mission of the schools. And you asked about athletics. That's not a central tenet of United World Colleges. But as you know, I some years later, after this whole experience, I became the first person to row a boat from California to Hawaii with no prior rowing experience. And I was an athlete.
Didn't have prior rowing.
I was not a rower. I was not a rower. I was not a sailor. I had never been to sea.
Well, you're an extraordinary athlete. I mean, 45 marathons, 2 Ironmans, and rowing. And it's not a small boat. I mean, it's a significant vessel that you row from California to Hawaii. What was the athletic upbringing like that inspired all that activity?
I got into endurance sports while going through depression in college. So this was a few years after UWC, after United World College. I was studying in Minnesota at McAllister College and was going through a period of depression. And my roommate said, you need to get off that sofa and let's go do a triathlon. So we signed up for a half Ironman, and I was comfortable in the water, but not a proficient swimmer. I didn't know how to do laps in an efficient way or anything like that. And so it was a real learning curve for me. Was not a distance runner beforehand or anything. And so dove in, discovered I love triathlons, and ended up signing up for an Ironman my next year. And then fast forward, started doing ultra marathons and all these different events, and did that for about 10, 12 years. Then in 2016, I was studying in London, getting my MBA at London Business School, and racing. Life was great. And then suddenly my father died, and he actually took his life. And in the grief that followed, I decided to row across an ocean alone. Partially as an experience to process his passing, but also as a way to make my life count, to do something really special with this short time I have here on Earth, to do something meaningful and to inspire other people. And so that is actually what led me to row across an ocean.
So like ultra marathons and Ironmans wasn't enough.
No, man. I mean, each time I pushed the limit a little bit and discovered I can do it, then it just begs the question, what else?
Well, that's pretty extraordinary to just start doing that at that point in your life. Were you a cross country runner? Was there any athletic thread that weaves between those things?
I did a lot of team sports as a kid, but I grew up with a lot of time with myself in the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. My parents split up when I was young, and my older siblings both moved out early. And spending a lot of time with myself, I enjoyed being in nature and exploring. And I always wanted a downhill ski race. We didn't have the money, and so I couldn't join the ski team. And so when I discovered triathlons, as a young adult, I was like, oh my God, this is what I've been wanting. I've been wanting to race for all these years. As a kid, though, I didn't want to pedal. I wanted to use gravity, but as I got older, I discovered, well, I can race. And by doing these self-propelled experiences, ultra marathons, triathlons, and now rowing, realize there's a lot to learn and discover through that process of applying myself and kind of refining the machine, right? And the mind-body connection. So it definitely ties back the threads as a kid, but it was definitely something I discovered over time more as an adult.
So there's the training and the athletic piece of, doing these things, but, what did you get from it, from the mental side of doing it?
Well, there's so many different pieces, right? I think a big part of it early on with at first when I was getting into endurance sports and going through depression was a sense of possibility and optimism. As I saw that I could grow into a better swimmer, become more proficient, as I pushed my limits with running, all these different things, it helped me realize I can grow, that I can make change. I do have agency in my life, right? And it starts in one domain, swimming or cycling or whatever it may be. But then that shift can apply elsewhere. And so it's that sense of optimism and possibility that I think is one of the most immediate benefits that comes from exercise. And we know that, right? There's a very strong mind-body connection from exercise. We know it's great for mental health. And when you pick goals that seem impossible and then do those, then the benefits are even greater because it totally redefines what you think is possible in your life.
I mean, I love water. Grew up around lakes. I love surfing in the ocean. But rowing from California to Hawaii presents a certain amount of unknown and depth and things that just, I think, would invoke fear and isolation. I mean, there's a lot of things there, right? How do you just decide that is going to be the vehicle to process your father's death and do something unique and special with your life?
I was lucky enough to see a film that inspired me. It wasn't like I did this analysis and created a spreadsheet and looked at all the different ways to process my father's passing. It was the world presenting me with what became very obviously my path. So I was, like I mentioned, living in London, and I went to a film festival called the Ocean Film Festival. And in it, there was a short film about a woman who rode around the world. And as soon as I saw it, I thought, holy shit, I need to do that. And it took me a few weeks before I said it out loud because it sounds crazy, right? I wasn't a rower, wasn't a sailor. I have this idea I'm going to row across an ocean alone. Like just uttering those words at first, it took me a month to muster the courage to tell someone, I think I'm going to row across an ocean. But once that seed was planted, within a few months, I really committed and started telling everybody. And then it became a question of figuring out how. Because it's actually logistically complex, an expedition like that to organize.
So that's just incredible. So was there like, because it sounded like you suffered for depression and then you transitioned, you found a way or somebody helped you out, and sports is something that, doing these really intense athletic experiences has really, helped your mindset. Did you have fear at that moment? Why you felt like you needed to do something? Because you had fear that you would go back into a depressive state, and this was going to help you through that? Or what was that something that you thought about?
It wasn't really an analysis. It was just a knowing, right? When I first heard of ocean rowing, I knew immediately that was something that I would do. And the greater context that you reference, I mean, when someone's parent passes, you naturally go through a period of grief. When the circumstances are such that they took their own life, then there's a lot of soul searching that happens after that, right? And so certainly, it was a different nature of depression than the one that I experienced that first led me to endurance sports. But it was in that period of wondering, what can I possibly do with my life? Where do I have that agency? What choices do I have in my own life to make a life that is meaningful and matters? And so it was with that level of questioning happening that when I discovered ocean rowing, I just knew that would be a force function for my growth. I knew that being out on the ocean would be a huge opportunity to grow and reflect, but I also knew simply getting to the start line, pulling off the project, all of the branding, the fundraising, all the campaign management pieces. Unless you're independently wealthy, you have to figure out, how do you fund an expedition, right? And so then that becomes a business question. And I knew that this kind of a project spoke to me as an athlete, spoke to me as an explorer, spoke to me as someone who cares about conservation and could use the project to raise funds for something that matters. And it spoke to me as an entrepreneur. How do I pull this off logistically and financially? And so it was way harder than I could have fucking fathomed when I first got the idea. And it took way longer, but I was right. It was a force function and it worked out.
So how long did it take you, and what were some of the biggest challenges to get you to that start line?
So it was October 2016 when I saw the film and knew that I would row across an ocean. And it was July 2020 when I first set foot in my boat. So coming up on 4 years at that point.
Wow.
And there were a few milestones along the way. I thought I would be able to fund it through corporate sponsorship. Turns out that's a hard nut to crack when you don't have an established brand or track record. And so while I was working on raising sponsorship, I kept putting in half of my paychecks. I was doing management consulting for Deloitte at the time, after my MBA. So I was self-funding it to the extent I could for a few years, just to start building a boat and pulling these pieces together. And after about 3 years, I realized I just wasn't going to make it alone. And people had been asking, hey, how can we help you out? And when people asked me that, what I said was, I want you to give to the scholarship fund. So we were talking earlier about United World Colleges. When I decided to row across an ocean, I realized this is one way I can give back to the United World College movement. Ever since that experience changed my life, I wanted other students to have that opportunity. So I created this campaign, nonprofit campaign called United World Challenge. That was the banner under which I decided to row across an ocean, and dedicated it to raising scholarships for United World Colleges. And so when people said, hey, how can we help you, Tez? I said, donate to the scholarship fund. But after a while, I realized I need other help. And I launched a crowdfund that ended up raising 75 grand to help cover costs of the expedition. And those are just a couple of the pieces along the way. Obviously, there's learning logistics, learning survival at sea, learning how to use these equipment, navigation, communication, all those different components. But most of my time was really spent around management, campaign building, communications, and fundraising.
When you're in the water paddling between California and Hawaii, like, to me, I'm trying to mentally be you in that moment. Like, I feel like the night would just be the scariest for a few reasons. I mean, light's an issue, but at some point you have to sleep, right? Like, how do you keep a boat heading where you want it to head while you're in currents and you're not conscious to make sure you're headed the right way?
Prayers and wishes, my friend. Prayers and wishes. There's not much I can really do about that. Some people ask, do you drop an anchor? I can't drop an anchor overnight. There is something called the sea anchor, which is like a parachute that in rough and adverse conditions, I would deploy on about 200 feet of line. And that stabilizes the boat by sitting beneath the waves and preventing me from drifting to a degree. But it's a matter of assessing the conditions and making a judgment call, because deploying that para anchor takes an hour and retrieving it takes an hour, and it's a real pain. And so it becomes a question of, can I rest? Do I need to cycle my sleep and not sleep overnight? But what in one stage of the row, I entered a counter current where when I rested, I would more or less be drifting backwards, back towards land. And so during that week, I switched from sleeping at night to sleeping every few hours. I would row for 3 hours, rest for 2, and try and grab a little wink of sleep in that 2-hour stretch. And it was awful. They say polyphasic sleep, you need less sleep overall, but it takes a while to adjust, and a week was not quite sufficient. So thankfully, when I made it past that counter current at the end of my 3rd week, then I switched back and would sleep at night and would drift. It's really when you're near land, so at the start of an ocean row or when I was approaching Hawaii, when the margin is much lower. And so I rode the first 20 hours straight to get offshore. And on my second to last day, when I could see land and knew I wanted to make landfall before dark the next day, then I rode the last 36 hours nonstop, because those are the areas where I couldn't, sleep, and drifting would be a serious risk. So it's you just judge the conditions that you have.
Talk about mindset. Jeez. How does that, where do you get the strength or the adrenaline or to row for 36 hours straight?
When you're in a position where there isn't a really good alternative, it's amazing what humans can do when you really commit to something. And it was very obvious that there wasn't an alternative in this situation. If I rested, all of this work for all of these years would be at risk. And so, you mind the basics, right? Make sure I'm eating, make sure I'm drinking, taking care of myself in the heat, wearing clothing so I don't get too beat by the sun, those kinds of things. But ultimately, it becomes a decision. What am I doing? Can I take one more stroke? So the last day wasn't so bad. I was used to rowing every day. The last night was beautiful, actually. There's bioluminescence all over the water and shooting stars overhead. It was just a magical last night. But when the sun came up on my last day and I'd been rowing for 24 hours already, that's when it got tough. And at that point, my body was exhausted and I couldn't handle the heat very well. And so although I'm rowing gently, right? If I'm rowing 10, 12 hours a day on average, it's like a walking pace. I compare it to walking, where you can walk and you can have a conversation. You'll get tired, but you're never out of breath. And yet on this last day, I found myself out of breath. I could take just a couple of oar strokes before I needed a break. And I thought, man, this is the one day where the stakes are the highest. The one day where I don't have margin to take a little break. And this is the day where I'm forced to, really pace myself. And I started repeating to myself, my body is hot, but I am fine. I am rowing to the finish. And at first I could just get a couple of oar strokes in and say a couple of words, but I kept repeating that to myself for an hour. By the end of it, I was shouting, I am rowing to the finish, and kind of roaring on these oars, and was able to make it into the bay in Oahu just before sunset. And that was September 11th, 2020. And I became the first person ever to row from California to Hawaii with no experience.
Oh, wow. So I have a question about that mindset, like piggybacking on your question. Like in our world, we push hard in the workplace, right? And Gabe and I work hours that are really, really long, start early and go late. And some of the younger producers who come in, there'll be a pressure to perform at that level. And the response or coaching we give them is like, look, if you're not used to waking up at 5 and working till 10 at night or whatever, it's just like lifting a weight. You can't just totally go there overnight. You've got to adapt your brain and work it like a muscle and level up your mindset over a period of time and get to that place. It's not an overnight thing. Is there some truth to that in how you're framing it, or can you just be an anomaly where you just go there?
No, I would absolutely agree with that. It's something you develop over time, a skill that comes with practice and consistency. And a key lesson is not to compare yourself to others. We hear that all the time, but the fact is we're all in different points in our journey, right? And these skills, the skill acquisition is not a linear process. Change all around the world in economics and social dynamics and what we know in physics, in biology, all around the world, change happens on logarithmic scales, on compounding scales. And what this means is when someone is at step 1, they're someone at step 3, it's not like they're 2 steps ahead. They're ahead, right? They're 9 steps ahead. And so that's where the comparison gets really tough, because it's discouraging looking at other people. But when you're consistent, then those gains compound on each other, and we underestimate how far we can go. Like, people often overestimate what you can do in a year. You radically underestimate what you can do in 5 years. And it's just about being consistent at the steps along the way, and then be completely surprised where you end up multiple years from now. And that's where, to your point, it's around the consistency, the practice, the exercise. And then over time, then you're at a spot where you're accustomed and habituated to have a wild schedule and working, 16-hour days like yourself.
How did you prepare for that end part? Like, how did you anticipate that? Did you know you were going to row 36 hours in a row, or is it just,
did you not the plan? No, I woke up on the second to last day, and I knew that's what it had been.
So there
really was a culmination in all of these years of work, right? Getting to the start line was the hardest thing and then once I was on the water, that was by far the hardest thing I've ever done. And so once you've gotten to the last stretch of what is a massive 4-year undertaking, what are 36 hours at the end of the day? That's a blink of an eye. And so that's a little reframe that was helpful. But also, like I said, I'd never been to sea, and I didn't know what to expect. I was really shocked by how beautiful the ocean is. The color of the water, the shape of the waves, the wildlife that I got to see. And when I was tired, I realized that if I just focus on the beauty around me, I would forget how tired I was. I would just be in a state of gratitude, looking at what's here and grateful to be able to witness it. And so on the hardest days, not just on the last day where I was rowing for 36 hours, but on the hard beginning where it felt like I would never make it, those were the moments where focusing on the beauty was even more important. Because at the end, I knew I would make it if I just keep going. But when you don't know that you can make it, if you can find something beautiful along the way to focus on, then that can give you so much energy to keep going.
Did you see any beautiful sharks while you're out there?
I did. I saw 3 sharks, which is kind of tragic because we've lost, I think close to 70% of the sharks around the world in the past 50 years due to overfishing, shark finning, a number of threats facing sharks. So spent 10 weeks on the ocean and only saw 3. And they're really beautiful. One shark that I saw was a Thresher Shark, which is just, if you Google Thresher Shark, they're fantastic animals.
Are they supposed to thrash your boat?
They are very shy. So I saw it. I put my hand in the water to try and get it to come a little closer so I could get a good look, and it disappeared. The bubbles from my hand scared it off. You know, the stories we have about sharks tend to not be exactly true. They're very different types of personalities in different species, and the Thresher Shark is very shy. But what it does do is it uses its tail to create a hypersonic wave in the water that stuns prey. And the wave is so strong it can split hydrogen and oxygen molecules apart from water. And yeah, it's a special animal.
That's amazing.
So it probably could have ended your trip with this thrash.
If it took, you know, if it wanted to, but no, divers spend their whole careers trying to see a Thresher Shark because they're scared of bubbles. Like, they're really timid.
Wow. Is there an opposite to that? Was there anything tragic that you saw, whether that be, you know, the impact of humans or something bad
Absolutely.
in the way?
Yeah, absolutely. It's this wild paradox where when I was out at sea, at times the people nearest to me were in the International Space Station, right, 250 miles above Earth. Because I went like 6 weeks without even seeing another boat. And yet I saw plastic every day, right? Bags, bottles, cups, shoes, rope, even household items like hampers, pens, all sorts of things. And then a lot of unidentifiable little bits of plastic, microplastics and such. Every day. And it was heartbreaking to see at once the beauty of the ocean and at the same time how impacted it is by all of us around the world. And so when I got to Hawaii, I really wanted to do more for ocean conservation. Together with the supporters of United World Challenge, we raised 77 grand for UnitedWorldCollege scholarships and sent 3 students to United World College of the USA. They just graduated, and speaking of podcasts, we're going to release a United World Challenge podcast interview with a couple of those graduates. And so that was cool. Like I said, I always wanted to pay that experience to new students, and we've done that. But when I got to Hawaii, I really wanted to do more for ocean conservation. So it's not yet public, but on September 18th, I'm announcing the next United World Challenge expedition, and that's going to focus really on ocean pollution. We can create clean oceans for the future.
You know, we live in San Diego, so we're along the ocean, and we see those same things every single day we go to the beach. And yeah, it's a weird feeling, you know, it's like a disappointment or something.
Of course. Yeah, it's definitely disappointing. And truthfully, California is in a great place. The currents don't carry that much plastic to California. And the ocean plastic issues are, you know, coming from more developing regions. And so it's definitely sad, you know, anywhere you go to the coastline, but some places are really, it's devastating. Hawaii has been hit very heavily. The currents carry the microplastic from the Great Pacific Garbage Patch and deposit it all over Hawaii's beaches. And so the solution here.
Is that because the world is using the ocean as garbage?
Yeah, pretty much. What happens is obviously we produce way too much plastic. Use it in places it doesn't belong. It's an amazing material. We rely on it, and we'll continue to rely on it because it's highly effective. And we've gotten so fucking careless about when and how we use it. So that's problem number 1. Problem 2 is a lot of the places that contribute most to ocean plastic simply don't have waste infrastructure. And so it's developing regions with high urban populations along coastlines with seasonal rainfall. What happens is they dispose of their plastic in the streets or in canals, and monsoons come and flush it out to sea. So there are about 1,000 rivers around the world that contribute 80% of ocean plastic. And the solution is to just it's really quite simple, build barriers in these waterways, typically non-navigable waterways, that don't impact the ecology, but are able to be serviced on a daily basis to gather the plastic before it flows out to sea. So there are a number of organizations doing that work already, and I'm excited to begin partnering with them and help accelerate their work.
Is that what is next for you? Like I know you're a public speaker. That's how you earn your living. But it sounds like you have a more purposeful intent on what you're going to do with your life based on these experiences. Is that where it's headed?
Keynote speaking will remain a pillar of what I do simply because of the experience I've had. Growing from experiencing depression to becoming a world record athlete is a story that shows what's possible. And then I've had some more setbacks recently. A year ago tomorrow, I had a heart attack.
Wow.
Out of the blue, completely unexpected. And so I've recovered from that heart attack really well. And like I mentioned, in September, in 2 months, I'm announcing the next expedition. And so speaking is a way to share this story that inspires people. In my words, I say, find your ocean and the courage to cross it. So I'll continue to do keynote speaking. I think it can really impact people and help make the world a better place. I'm also, like I mentioned, preparing this next expedition that's focused on ocean conservation and working on a documentary film. So those are the things right now. Once those are buttoned up in a few years' time, I'm interested in business as a force for good and developing sustainable triple bottom line businesses that help solve ocean plastic upstream.
Will you just define triple bottom line for people who might not be familiar?
Right. So we know what the most common bottom line is: financial profit, right? Quarterly return. Let's see what the market can do for us. And that's going to continue to be a driving force. But we realize that also leaves out two other real stakeholder groups. One is people. How does this positively impact people? And then there's the planet and our natural ecosystems. So triple bottom line is measuring the impact a business has, not simply on its financial shareholders, but on stakeholders, including natural systems. And I think that's a really powerful model for creating businesses that are really generative, not just extractive, but generating a better future.
It's like a humanity plus business.
Yeah, circular economy. Yeah.
Got it.
So if we guess the next destination, will you tell us? Will you blink twice if we get it right?
I will blink twice no matter what you say, and encourage you to follow United World Challenge for the announcement on September 18th.
All right.
I did want to touch
18th.
on the heart attack thing, because that was, somebody that you never would expect someone in your shape, with your athletic abilities, to even have any kind of heart issue. So did you get any kind of, so I know you're a really curious guy. So what caused it, or what did you find out that caused that to happen? And how can you prevent that from happening again?
Well, the first thing is really just being in shape as possible. But I think the story would look very different, right? I not only would have tolerated the heart attack, but recovering from it would have been significantly more difficult. And so thankfully I've bounced back. And so I think a lesson is just take good care of yourself, take care of your heart and your cardiovascular health. As for causes, some things just can't be prevented, right? We did all sorts of tests, and the test we did came back negative or inconclusive, without weighing too far into controversy around cardiac events. We do know that there is an increase in cardiac events the past few years. And so whatever you ascribe that to is, you can be informed and look at that trend. I'm just one story. There are many stories of athletes specifically having heart attacks when a few years back that wasn't really happening. And so what we don't know is the likelihood of recurrence. This hasn't been going long enough for us to know. Do people who survive heart attacks have them again in these circumstances? I'm trusting that I won't. I could choose to live the rest of my life within an hour of a hospital, and that would be a very sad life. And so part of my recovery from my heart attack was making myself uncomfortable again. It was going for walks in the backcountry, challenging myself to put myself in a position where if something were to go wrong, it would be a little bit tough. But I need to be comfortable in that setting, because if I avoid it, I will be unhappy. And so now, a year later, I'm back on my feet and running these 15, 20-mile trail runs in the backcountry in Colorado where I live. And when I'm back there, if something were to happen, it would take a few hours to get out. But I'm so happy to be recovered and back in these places where I feel free and expressed and creative and powerful. And so for me, the lesson is really continue to figure out what that edge is. And if I had just shied away from getting back out and getting active again, yeah, it would be hard to see how I'd chart a path forward. So
how long was that? What was that transition like to get to back to where you are today? Like,
It was a long road. No, it was a long road. So the first thing I had to do was rest, just straight rest for a few months. When you have a heart attack, part of the cardiac tissue dies. A lack of blood flow. Like that's the definition of a heart attack. A blocked artery causes a lack of blood flow, lack of oxygenation, and the cardiac tissue is injured or dies. What happens after that is it needs to scar up and strengthen because it doesn't regenerate. In that period where it's scarring, you need to rest. Because if I pushed myself in those moments, that weakened tissue could rupture and I could have died on the spot. And so I went from, squatting 225 pounds, which for someone who weighs 150 is a good number, to not even being able to like walk up a set of stairs without worrying about my heart rate, right? It was a real mindfuck. And I went from knowing that training is what keeps me well to realizing training could now kill me. And I had to redefine training as rest. If I want to have an active lifestyle later, I need to sit on my ass. And so I sat on my ass for 3 months and it was awful. And then once I could start moving again, I started exercising and doing cardiac rehab, pushing my emotional comfort level, like I said, getting into the backcountry. And now, full swing. Tomorrow is a year from a day, and I'm going to repeat the workout I did last year with my film team. We're going to film it for the documentary film and replay what happened last year, but without the heart attack.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it is. Like reframing your mind, that rest is almost like training in that moment, But the question I have is, some people I've heard that are either in depression or have been through it have just described it as almost like being in a mental jail. And how you describe these journeys and things where you're pushing yourself and outdoors freedom. Is that an intentional link between why you sought these things out to deal with depression? And is when you talk to people or when people with depression reach out to you, is that a natural place to direct them to because of that, or what's the role there?
Well, we're all a little bit different. I don't think it's a one size fits all approach. We do know that exercise is good for mental health, right? And some level of exercise, I think, is good for everybody. Does everyone need to go out and be an endurance athlete? I don't think that's the answer. In my case, I find it something that I really enjoy. And that's really a bottom line, is what is something you enjoy that makes you feel filled, excited, and inspired? And doing that. Now, when you're in a depressed place, it's hard to have the motivation to take that first step. And part of the trick is realizing you shouldn't wait for the motivation to come. The motivation follows action. If you go and do these things, you create the conditions to feel good. But if you wait until you feel good, you might never go and do those things until you stay stuck. And so for me, movement becomes that way to build that momentum. But for other people, it could be something else. It could be a knitting club. It could be anything. But what is that thing that fills your cup?
How did you know Gabe was in a knitting club? That is weird.
I'm competitive.
I could tell by the shirt.
Is that what your friend did for you in that moment? Is pulling you off the couch to move?
Totally. Yeah. It's wild to think back where I would be if he hadn't said, hey, let's go do a triathlon together. And that's the other thing with like comparing yourself to other people's journeys. You don't know where your journey is going to go. I would have never guessed that I'd become an ocean rower, right? When he said, get off the couch. But it was that journey and just following what lit me up and what got me excited, right? That it led to this thing that's now an integration of my business skill sets, my communication skill sets, my physical and health skill sets all coming together. Could have never planned that. But just by listening to what excited me, it led me to that place.
I love the whole conversation we're having. I think what you said at the end is like what resonates most to me, though. It's like if you sit around and wait for motivation, nothing may ever happen, right? Like just getting out and moving and creating energy and then having that motivation come along. I've never heard it like framed up quite like that, but that applies to everybody.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's something I still have to remember myself, right? Look, I have hard days too. We all do, right? And even after all these years, I still struggle to get myself to the gym, right? Even though I know how much better I'll feel afterwards. And so I share these lessons because I have to remind myself of them too. And that's something that we can all remember, right? That this journey continues.
First one is, what is your favorite mantra?
I am grateful for this opportunity.
I like that. Yeah. Given our big proponents of gratitude equals happiness. Yeah. I feel like you have a lot of superpowers, especially mentally, but aside from the things we've already discussed, if you were to name one more superpower to add to your arsenal, what would it be?
I think it's taking a setback and finding a way to grow from it.
I like that.
I think he's doing that one as well already.
He has it for sure.
But we'll accept it.
Yeah.
So a new superpower. You want a new superpower?
Yeah.
Oh, I missed that part. Okay. A new superpower. Oh man. Okay. I would like to be independently wealthy to shortcut some of these fundraising efforts. The process. I remind me the process is fun, but sometimes it's a grind. And where I'm at right now, would love to just be able to self-fund some of these projects.
He's such a good guy. Like yours is that you want to see people naked. You know, like his it has a good cause. His has a good cause. Are you off?
Yeah. Oh, this one's since you were at sea for 71 days. What was the most interesting animal you encountered?
I saw a number of creatures that I didn't know what they were. So in that current that I mentioned, that counter current, it's a big current that flows from the Arctic Sea up in Alaska down to California. It's called the California current. And it's this cold, nutrient-rich current that carries a lot of life. You've seen Finding Nemo, like they go with the current across the ocean. It's real. It's a thing, right? And so at night, I'm leaning over the side of my boat with a headlamp, looking at all these weird alien-type creatures that are coming up to the surface. Not only do they flow with the current, they also, the largest migration on Earth happens every day from the deep ocean to the surface at night. And so I'm leaning over the edge, looking at all these weird animals, no idea what they were, all sorts of strange shapes and jellies. And that was definitely a strange evening.
So you didn't have your phone where you could Google it?
No, I couldn't just quickly Google it. Unfortunately, there's some things you got to wait to Google later. And then, yeah.
Next time one of our listeners finds himself in the middle of the Pacific with somebody at the space station as the closest person around, what's the go-to fuel source that you survived by?
I ate a lot of dehydrated meals, and they got mighty boring after a while. So after some weeks, it becomes a question of what I'm willing to tolerate. My favorite thing in the end are my jelly bellies, because they're all different flavors, and you just want sugar from rowing all day long.
That's great. So this next question is about you reflecting back on the younger version of Tez. What kind of advice would you give him, knowing what you know today?
I think a big thing is around mentorship, right? You come across different leaders and people you get to work with. And I've done a decent job of this, staying in touch with people over the years. But I think earlier on, intentionally building a sort of board of advisors for my personal growth and navigating career choices, that's a powerful thing, right? Who is that tight community of more senior advisors for you? I think my advice would be to pull that together earlier.
These are our last two questions, but there was one I wanted to ask that I didn't get to yet, which was you're surrounded by the ocean, you're on this vessel. Do you just jump in the water and swim around every once in a while, or how's that work?
Absolutely. So I stay tethered to the boat.
Yeah.
One thing we didn't hit, just like logistical question, there's no one with me. There's no support boat, no chase boat. I bring everything I need start to finish. And one of the safety mechanisms here is that I stay tethered to the boat when I'm rowing or when I go for a swim. I'm wearing a climbing harness and then a line. And going for a swim was absolutely amazing. I mean, it's quite close to being in outer space because you see pretty much the same thing in absolutely every direction. Just this incredible crystal blue.
All right. So then the last question, the podcast is called Discover the Difference. And what's that secret thing about you, that ingredient that makes you uniquely you and capable of doing these things?
There's a phrase that really resonates with me is the quality of our life depends on the quality of questions we ask ourselves. And I've asked myself some hard questions about what I want to do with my life. What are my possibilities? What's my potential? And when I get answers, I listen to them, but I'm also not satisfied. So I explore the answer I get, and then I ask the question again.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. For listeners that want to reach out, want to learn more, want to consume you or invite you to be a keynote at one of their events, what's the best way for them to connect?
Follow me on LinkedIn at Tez Steinberg. And for information about my keynote talks, visit teztalk.com. If you're interested in the expeditions and this next expedition for ocean conservation, visit UnitedWorldCollege.org or follow United World Challenge or Tez Steinberg on social media.